Okay, welcome to Cold Day number two, psychology lesson. And after talking about the brain, now we want to get into more of the actual study of psychology. And this week we want to cover two individuals, Sigmund Freud as well as B.F. Skinner, as two of the founding fathers of psychology. One thing that you're going to find with Sigmund Freud is he's an interesting dude. A little bit weird, a little bit ironic. But here's a joke about Sigmund Freud. Hopefully, this makes sense at the end of the lesson. If you don't laugh right now, I am not offended. Same with this one. If you don't know what psychoanalysis is or what a Freudian slip is right now, that's fine. But we'll revisit these, and hopefully, you get a little bit of humor out of this at the end of the hour. So, the first guy, once again, that we want to look at is considered to be one of the founding fathers of psychology, and that is Sigmund Freud. And I tried to get a picture of him smiling, and this is the best that I could get. But Sigmund Freud is considered to be one of the fathers of modern psychology. He is an individual who is very unique. Um, when asked about psychology, Sigmund Freud is a person that most people can identify. If you ask who's the world's most famous psychologist, a lot of people have already heard of Sigmund Freud. And if you've heard of him before this class, that's great. If you haven't, that's no big deal. But in pop culture, he is considered to be very famous. A little bit of biographical background of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund was born in the 1850s, and he was born in Europe. He was always considered to be a unique individual, somewhat selfish, dishonest individual. He spent most of his life in a very diverse city of Vienna, Austria. Now, if you think about his lifetime, the 1850s, he's going to live into the 1940s. He is going to experience World War I as well as World War II in Europe. He was a celebrity for his time. For a new science, he is the face of the science. Sigmund Freud was known for being a high energy individual. And in being high energy, he was very productive. They said that he used to split his days into thirds. So he felt that he got 3 days where everybody else got one. So his goals is when he woke up at 6 a.m., he would finish a day's work by noon. And then at noon, he'd start his second day. And from noon to 6 was his second day. He'd continually work, and he'd get a second day of work done by 6 p.m. And then his third day was 6 p.m. until midnight. So he's a relentless worker, very, very productive. When he walked down the street, everybody knew who he was. They didn't always like him, but they knew who he was. One way that he probably kept his productivity, one way that he kept his high energy is he was known to be a cocaine addict. And you do a lot of coke, and your mind gets racing. And he was an intelligent individual, but he was considered to be a drug addict. One of the famous stories of Sigmund Freud is he was up for a Nobel Prize in medicine as well as in literature. And they think that he was going to win the Nobel Prize in medicine, but there was actually a letter written by an individual saying, you cannot give this to Sigmund Freud. He is just a lowly, pathetic psychologist. And that letter was written by Albert Einstein. And according to the board that was voting on this, if Einstein says do something, you do it. He's considered to be a moody individual. He would make up stories to try to influence people to act the way that he wanted them to act. He always was studying the subconscious and the unconscious that we'll talk about a little bit later, and would oftentimes lie or be too harsh to his friends with being too honest. So not a nice guy. He is weird. We'll tell some stories of that. He's weird, very, very weird at times. Sigmund Freud is unique. He has his theory that's known as psychoanalysis, and it's a theory of personality development. Now, there are a couple different theories of personality that we're going to look at this year. But one thing that's unique about Sigmund Freud is psychoanalysis is very, very broad. Most theories that we will look at, so all right, what are the causes of schizophrenia? What are the causes of depression? They'll be very narrow, one or two causes, or one or two things to look at within the theory. Psychoanalysis is very broad. And psychoanalysis is the study of the unconscious as well as the subconscious. So the below the surface things that you can't really test. Now, most of Sigmund Freud's claims have been disproven with modern studies, but he's kind of a unique individual in psychoanalysis. Another biographical piece of information with Sigmund Freud is that he died living in London. So he spent most of his life in Austria, but he was living in Austria during World War II. And he was claimed to be a Jew who was trying to destroy Christianity in that area. And there's some legitimacy to that claim, a Jew that was trying to destroy Christianity in the area. But he eventually escaped. And as he escaped, he eventually went to London, spent a couple years in London during World War II, and that's actually where he died. So lived during a tumultuous time, was a very, very interesting and, yes, a weird individual. But he is famous for psychoanalysis, and this is the most commonly studied theory of personality within the introduction of psychology. So the first thing we want to look at with a Freudian slip is we are dealing with the unconscious. So we are going to say a word that we really didn't mean to say within the sentence. So here's the cartoon. A Freudian slip is when you say one thing but mean your mother when you mean to say the word another. You'll see this on newscasts now and then. You'll see this in politics, where individuals will have what is known as a Freudian slip, where maybe they say something that is inappropriate at that moment. And according to Sigmund Freud, it all goes back to what's in their unconscious. Now, Sigmund Freud believes that there are two motivators in this world, or really one and a half. And the number one motivator is anything that it has to do with sexual pleasure. Sigmund Freud believed that everything can be pushed back to sexual pleasure. The second thing is every action that you take can be described or verified by your relationship with your mother. So with Sigmund Freud, we're going to talk a lot about unconscious thought and about relationships with the mother. Now, the thing with Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis is most of his theories have been disproven. However, they were accepted at some point in psychology. So a Freudian slip is saying a word when you need an inappropriate word, or a different word when you mean another word. And here's where we get that joke. I'd love to make a pun about psychoanalysis, but I'm a Freud. It would be considered silly and immature. Do you know any psychology jokes? I'm a Freud not. Saying another word. Now, the relation back to your mother. I've been feeling depressed lately. Your mom's depressed. The anxiety has been overwhelming. Your mom is overwhelming. This isn't helping. Your mom isn't helping. So everything is traced back to a relationship with your mom. And he's also kind of a sick individual, and we'll talk about that more later. So once again, we're looking at unconscious motivation. You may not know why you do what you do. Think back to your relationships and your actions. Now and then, you will meet somebody and you just don't like them. And you maybe aren't able to explain why you don't like them. Sigmund Freud would state that, well, you don't like them because they remind you of somebody that your mother would not like, therefore you do not like them. Why did you treat somebody mean? And well, you felt that that person was disrespectful to your mother. we'll now and then ask, why do you date somebody? Why would you marry that person? Sigmund Freud's explanation is the reason that you date someone is that you have a goal to marry somebody who is just like either your mother or your father. Sigmund Freud believes that all females at one point in their life wish they were men. And therefore they honor their father, females honor their fathers because they are jealous of their fathers. And all girls have a hatred of their mother because their mother is not a male. It's a little weird stuff. Why do you feel a certain way about a friend or person? If you can't articulate why you feel this way, Sigmund Freud will always explain, well, it goes back to mom. With the unconscious motivation and the establishment of personality, Sigmund Freud identified 3 cognitive systems that work in our subconscious. These 3 systems are known as the id, the ego, and the superego. Okay? The id and the superego fight with each other. The ego brings them back into check. Okay. So the first thing in our personality development, according to Sigmund Freud, is we all have and are born with what is known as an id. Okay. The id is present at birth. It's an animalistic part of ourself. Basic motivations: food, drink, pee, poop, warmth. And then Sigmund Freud always throws in sexual satisfaction. It's our animalistic thing. We don't think about consequences of anything. We see it, we want it. And there's no reality here. There's no idea of being disciplined. There's no idea of consequences for actions. It's see it, want it. This is our most animalistic part of ourself. We do not distinguish reality from fantasy. This is what Sigmund Freud calls the pleasure principle. And this is a really bad video, a really, really poorly done video, but it actually teaches a lesson pretty well.
According to the psychoanalytic theory, the unconscious, which controls most of our behaviors, is comprised of thoughts, wishes, feelings, and memories that have been repressed from consciousness because they arouse anxiety. But even though we're not aware of our unconscious thoughts, they have a powerful influence on the decisions we make, like decisions about our professions, mates, and habits.
So this is this video's explanation of the id. Once again, the animalistic, sometimes rage, sometimes inappropriate thoughts that we have as individuals. Eventually, as we grow, the id will be suppressed. So when you think of the id, think of a 3-year-old kid that doesn't know right from wrong, or a 2-year-old kid that is just curious and wants to do something and will grab anything, even though it may cause harm to himself or to those around him. That would be the id. And here's the video portrayal of this.
See that old lady over there? She looks like the old babysitter that you used to have. You hated that babysitter. She used to send you to bed without any dinner. Kill the old lady. Take her out.
Oh God, what makes me do these evil things?
Freud thought that the personality develops as a result of conflict between people's pleasure-seeking and aggressive impulses, and the way their desires for pleasure and aggression fit in society's rules. Our pleasure and aggression impulses come from our innate drives. Freud theorized that the conflict between our innate drives and the rules for society centers on 3 interacting parts of the mind: the id, the ego, and the superego.
The id is a real pleasure seeker, and it wants immediate gratification. It wants sex.
Come here, baby.
It's into aggression.
Hey, I'll smash you to bits.
And what it wants right away.
Now! Give it to me now!
The ego tries to meet the id's needs the best it can without letting it run wild and wreak havoc.
Okay, so once again, a great video to teach. So the id is what we have at birth. As we go on, we eventually develop an ego. The ego develops out of the id in infancy, so 2, 3, 4 years old. And now we start to understand reality. We start to understand logic. And the ego is the mediator between the id and the superego. So the two battles within ourselves. So think of this as the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder. The id is the devil. I want this now. The superego is the angel. And the in-between, to negotiate between those, is what we call the ego. And we'll show more examples of this as we get into class. We're also going to watch a movie that outlines the id, the ego, and the superego pretty well. But the ego is the mediator between the id and the superego. It has an understanding of how to suppress desire for pleasure.
The ego operates under the reality principle, keeping desires realistic and under control so they can bring long-term pleasure instead of pain and chaos. The ego mediates between the wild desires of the id and the restraints imposed by the superego.
The superego is like a conscience that represents society's norms and values.
Okay, we'll stop that right there and we'll go back to some notes. The superego. The superego is developed depending on what culture you are a part of. There are certain social norms. There are certain behaviors that are accepted within your culture. And as you grow, you eventually start to understand what is accepted. So kind of an example is personal space. In some areas of the world, it's perfectly acceptable to be within a couple of inches of the other person's face and talk. Here in the United States, we need a little bit more space. Get away from us. We don't like close talkers here. But the superego starts to internalize what society expects of you. So when we think back to the superego development, we now look back at grade school. The id wants to do whatever it wants, pleasure. The superego then starts to negotiate what society wants you to behave like. So let's say you're in second grade and the bell rings. What does the teacher want? The teacher usually wants you to sit down and be quiet. The superego now knows that that is the moral standard. The id wants to stand up and run around, and you probably had those classmates that did that. But the superego now knows exactly what is wanted by society. There's no individualistic benefit of sitting down and being quiet when the bell rings. However, it is the expected behavior of society. Kind of other examples would be speeding when you're driving your car. A lot of people, when they first start to drive, want to go as fast as possible. But because we have internalized society's norms, we know that certain areas have speed limits and we will only go 35 miles an hour or whatever the posted speed limit is. And the superego is where we start to feel guilt, not because we feel that it is right or wrong, but we start to feel guilt because it is the opinion of others. As we look at the id wants to go as fast as possible. The superego kind of brings us back into what society wants us to do. And the ego would be the mediator between the two.
It goes one step past the ego by considering not only the real, but also the ideal. The superego thinks about how we ought to behave according to our society. It uses ideas about morality that come from our parents and our environment, and gives us a strong sense of right and wrong. Our superegos can make us feel very proud or very guilty. It often opposes the id, and the ego works really hard to reconcile the two.
So once again, with Sigmund Freud is dealing with the unconscious, things that we can't see. With psychoanalysis, the usual way to study psychoanalysis, because we cannot see what is actually going on in the brain, is to question people. A series of questions, they give a response, and then the psychologist analyzes their response. So we ask ourselves, why did we do that? So why did you behave the way you behaved? You would give a response, and then the psychologist would analyze it. If it is a pleasure principle of you did it without any understanding of consequences, that's the id that has powered you. If you do that because it's what society wanted of you and expected of you, that is a super ego that's dealing with it. And somewhere in between, there is an ego. And as we get back to class, once the weather is a little bit warmer, we will watch a movie that outlines the battle between the id, the ego, and the superego. It's a movie titled Cat in the Hat. Have a great off day. Enjoy yourself, refreshed, and hopefully see you Friday.